University and National University's Institute of Visual Studies. So today it is our great honor to have Professor Gabriel with us again. He will give us a talk about the representations of nautical trade in the Maritime Museum in the context of Europe. His focus on how exhibition represents maritime trade as a strong driver of the global connections and cultural exchange from ancient times to modern times. And he would also analyze how these historical interactions affect how commerce is received and how it affects our present day's global society. So maybe you all know Professor G, but let me briefly introduce him. Professor G is an art historian, writer, and curator based in Switzerland, and he is teaching at the Nautical University and specializes in contemporary art theory and history. His research also focuses on the art of the port cities, on connected global histories, and contemporary artist practice. And he also co-founded an interdisciplinary study group on textiles and experience of trans-industrialities, and launched an online journal with this platform. And he recently co-edited a book called Maritime Poetics. So now I pass the time to Professor G. Let's welcome Professor G.
Thank you very much. Hello, everyone. Yes, thanks. Nice to see you again. Thanks for having me. Again, many thanks to MACAH and the Master for the invitation and the opportunity to share a couple of thoughts with you later in this month of April. Thanks to Professor Hélène Kwok, thanks to Professor Emilier, and thanks to Selina Ho for the invitation, and many thanks also to Lemon for organizing my visits. So thanks to you all for being here on a late Friday afternoon. I will try to be not be as long as last time. Let's see how it goes. And also hello, of course, to the Institute of Visual Studies at the National University. Hello to Taipei. Thanks for joining us online. I kind of intended originally to share his thoughts on market stalls, nautical trade, and nautical exhibitions before the more experimental coastal cooking piece that I presented last March. Although you'll see they are connected in many ways, and maybe this maritime field is also a work in progress. Although I have also distilled a little bit those ideas more like the coastal cooking piece. Let me get started. Globalization in its early days to the present has taken both land and maritime routes. In the early modern age, however, seas and oceans became strategic crossroads in the circulation of people, goods, ideas, which have shaped in all its complexity the interconnected world we now inhabit. At the junction between history, geography, and heritage studies, maritime museums and a number of history museums located in port cities provide visitors with perspectives on local and global maritime circulations. Their collections present various types of past and present maritime activities, commerce being one of them, not the only one, of course, but it's the one that I will try to focus more on today. The representation of maritime trade depicts a history of connected networks bringing different cultures into contact with each other, and it casts a reflective light on nautical economics and their histories, considering both the fortunes and the hardships that have accompanied the formation of an increasingly interconnected world. In looking at the representation of nautical trade in a selected number of exhibits today, I would like to focus on interlaced spaces I have been particularly interested in the past few years, so narrowing down in many ways to Europe, East Asia, and Southeast Asia, of course. The maritime museum can be found all over the world. But there is something, of course, strategic in that discussion related to the crossroads of the early modern age around the search for spices that brought European and Southeast Asian and Asian merchants and communities in contact. In particular, I'm interested in touching on some of the narratives related to trade that are carried in museums displays through objects, images, and spatial narratives in dialogue with contemporary artworks, which revisit current recurring motifs of the entangled maritime worlds. And I will thus try to interspace the discussion with a series of alternate contemporary curatorial and artistic research perspectives on the nautical world and nautical trade, including some I have been directly, modestly involved in the past few years, and which I see as variations and play on the traditional frame of the maritime museum. And so I hope to again try to mix things a little bit, seeing also your interest in both the museums and maybe museums traditions, but also contemporary art and contemporary art history and curatorial practices. So I hope there's a little bit for everyone. I suppose people have their own specific interest within that spectrum, of course. And just to finish that little word of introduction, given the interconnected history of trade from the early modern age to our contemporary era, with its variation of fortunes and contours, as well as what Walter Mignolo termed the darker side of modernity. I think the title of the book is The Darker Side of Western Modernity, but it's about that also that negative space in those stories of encounters. Such a dual perspective can reflect on the changing imaginaries of interconnected maritime regions, which continue to inform the present planetary age. To start with, perhaps, however, I want to begin our journey in the museum, institutions that display our society's heritage, which are strategically immersed in pedagogical missions that shape our perception and understanding of the past and present, which I'm so familiar with. And it can be useful to sketch a typology, brief sketch of maritime museums and museums dedicated to maritime histories and spaces, which tend to operate as an interface between the self and the other, the community within and the world beyond. I'm showing you to start with a selection of maritime museums in Europe. And the mission statement of these museums informs us on their initial mission. For instance, the Hellenic Maritime Museum in Athens, which is the one on the bottom right-hand side, it's actually located really in the Piraeus, the historical site of ancient Greece, the ancient Greek harbour. But the museum statement there reads, it was founded in 1949 and states that it was at the Maritime Gallery in Singapore, a city with similar history as a trading port for long-distance oceanic circulation. The aim is to, quote, to develop and promote Singapore as a premier global hub port and an international maritime center, and to advance and safeguard Singapore's strategic maritime interest, end of quote. This museum is quite peculiar. I would say there's not so many kind of artifacts or collector, so it's kind of really organized around different panels, and starting from the pre-British period, the Malay origins, but to going to the more modern shipping investment and finance of Singapore. And to find artifacts, there's a place in Singapore, but I'll go there shortly. At the Evergreen Maritime Museum in Taipei, just for I'll give a nod here, the goal is more specifically focused on ships. I quote, "The mission of Evergreen Maritime Museum is to present the history, art and science of boats and ships in the hope of generating public interest in maritime culture and in turn inspiring the pursuit of knowledge and the spirit of exploration," end of quote. And this should be seen in relation to the funding body, the company, Evergreen, well-known business in the transportation of cargo at sea. But actually the galleries also include a section on marine painting, which I will talk about a bit later, maritime Taiwan, and navigation, also a recurrent theme. So, just as a complementary note to this discussion on typologies, the actual buildings, the architecture within which these museums are located are also very, very interesting, I find, and in relation also to the place where they are positioned. The Maritime Museum in Malacca, Malaysia, is the one that you see on the top right-hand side, is housed in an early modern age Portuguese carrack. In Hong Kong, there's of course the pier location, but also the recently refurbished Museum of War of Resistance and coastal defense based in the former Lin Fort. I just saw that last year. Before that, 6 years ago, I think it was in the process of being refurbished, and also, I mean, for narrative questions, I won't go too much into this one, but it's also interesting how they revisited the displays there. And on the bottom left, it's back in Hamburg, but you see the same type of architecture, late German industrial buildings. It's part, but I took this is a picture from the area, which is known as the Speicherstadt, the city of spices, and they were all sort of built to house cargoes, and so that the little ships would go. The big ships couldn't go directly in there, so the cargo would be unloaded from the bigger ships through specific shipping vessels directly into the cranes in these warehouses. Of course, this, like many of these European late 19th century and even early 20th century architecture became obsolete with in the age of the shipping container. So, typical, the geographers are the specialists, so they follow the cycles, and it was abandoned, and then now it's really a heritage and tourist area. And so that's where you found the wonderful Hamburg Maritime Museum. And the last example that I've put here is one I visited had a chance to visit just last year in Fuzhou, and it's very recent. I believe 23 years ago, I think. But it's in a new cultural park. But the site is also very interesting because this was a former arsenal in the Maui arsenal that were built in the late 19th century, in the period of a so-called known as a self-strengthening, in China. And the display is quite interesting there because, of course, it addresses this story of increased confrontation, forced confrontation, but also the kind of movement of personnel, because the Chinese authorities also imported French and German engineers to help, kind of the industrial development, and it also has a link to air industry, but longer term. Quite very interesting place. On this note, on a side note on this question of architecture, there's a recent publication, very interesting, by Mel Groten, who explores the presence of empire in European cities. Really kind of focuses on Europe, but it's a really interesting point how factories, offices of shipping company, but also ships, besides the goods that were transported, also introduced an otherness to European population. So it's sort of, and so it looks in particular at the architecture. But I think it's a case that you can also, of course, you can think of the European buildings in outside of Europe, of course. So, well, Hong Kong, we mentioned that, but also the way that maybe forms of hybrid architecture that have also emerged later on. The other example in a say, for instance, an Asian context. The other book that you have here, it's in French here, but it reads The Taste of Others, the Taste of Others, from the colonial exhibition to always be careful with that one. First arts, that's one of the terms tricky terms. Alchemy is a term we use in French. This takes the 1931, this book's very interesting, takes this 1931 colonial exhibition in Paris, and the creation of the colonial museum in the early 1930s as a starting point for a discussion that reflects on this interplay between colonial visions, but and anthropology and ethnography. It's also, I mean, the thing, without going too much into it, but this exhibition, the collection, were then later on moved into other museums, the Musée de l'Homme, and also more recently the Museum of Gabriel, which is where the first arts are located. So, but something specific that I wanted to mention about Benoît de l'Étoile's argument, which is kind of, his argument is quite sophisticated. He's also saying that there were some nuanced layers in the vision of the people who were creating this museum in the 1930s. So they were not, but the point that I got really interested in was his distinction, the distinction that he makes between the Musée de Soi and the Musée des Autres, so the Museum of the Self and the Museum of Others. And the Museum of the Self represents a community, a village, a town, a city, a region, a nation, and revolves around the question, who are we? The Museum of the Other look at at that which is different, strange, and are typically linked to the development of anthropology as a discipline in the 19th century. And such museums investigate the question, who are the others? And I sort of find it inspiring to think about maritime museums and maritime exhibition as perhaps places where there was a particular kind of local global negotiation where this self and other was being balanced or certainly queried in different ways, of course, that we can analyze and critique, of course, but in a peculiar way that you don't necessarily find in other types of art or history and music. In other words, another aspect here to mention is that if Genesis, our creation openings, are informative, they're also always layered and already multiple and fragmented entities. This is what suggests Michel Foucault in a 1971 text on genealogy and history. And Emilie, I have to say that I sort of, this is a discussion that we find in your latest book as well, and so I thought, and that sort of inspired me to also to think about these genealogies here, thinking about these early institutions. And in this article, I briefly translated. Here you have the English on the right-hand side. Quote, another cruelty of history that forces us to turn the narrative on its head and abandon an adolescent quest. Behind the truth, always recent, stingy and measured, lies the millennia-old proliferation of errors. Truth is a kind of error who benefits from the fact that it cannot be refuted. No doubt because the long simmering of history has rendered it unalterable. So this idea that looking for an origin that holds a certain essence, a certain truth, of course, suggests is kind of misguiding. I'll give you another example of that, an interesting example, I think, of that in a second. In parallel, but I'm not going into it, I think all these cooking metaphors are really quite inspiring to me. The taste of others, this history being cooked in a pot. I was just participating in a panel last week in Xiamen. There was a creation of a new artistic research journal there called Studio Note, and remember my coastal cooking discussion for some of you who might have been there last month. I was presenting a marinated coast there as well, which is my contribution to their journal, if it's accepted. I'll see. But anyway, I pursue to give you some questioning of its origins. An example I was particularly interested in my early student days, I come from British art originally, was the quincentenary celebration of Columbus' 1492 voyage to the Americas, which involved the grand Regatta Columbus. It's one of those tall ship races. I don't know if surely they must have come to Hong Kong from time to time. And this one sort of they remade the journey of Columbus, starting from Spain, Cadiz, and then over towards the Caribbeans. And it all ended not as Columbus did, but rather in Liverpool. This is because it's also a kind of like heritage and tourism kind of event. So because it brings people over. These are wonderful sailing ships that are just used for heritage purposes. But the point here is that in Liverpool, a city I've been very interested in, the artist Keith Piper, who's someone made a proposal to the Blue Coat artistic director Brian Biggs, with whom I've been working for a while as well, but not back in the days. Not playing, but anyway, to make a counter event basically to this grand attack. It was called Trophies of Empire. You had a poster there. It was a series of exhibition with a number of artists in 3 cities in Britain, in England, so Liverpool and Bristol, which are, with London, you could say, the cities in Britain most associated with the slave trade, and Hull, because it was linked to also an important figure in the 19th century abolition of slavery, which Piper was also discussing in his work. So this is kind of an example of this questioning that I wanted to mention. Maybe since I was in Xiamen so recently, Ping is associated with Xiamen Dada, and this is the late artist who passed away. This is monumental exhibition in Paris. He's been living in Paris for a while. That he did at the Grand Palais galleries, which host like this huge, apex exhibits. But he made this piece really for it, called Empires, and you can see in it the skeleton of all Caesars. At the back there's a hat, that's a Napoleonic hat, so it alludes to the passing power reigns, you could say. And the last one, and the one that you see most of it here, clearly is one that we are still immersed in, is that of a shipping container that kind of gave this kind of city to it, standardized in the 1960s, say 1970s. And just making like just a parallel to that, this shipping container is also one that that I've been kind of I worked with. I'm showing you here. This is a more modest scale, obviously not at the Grand Palais, but this is in part of a festival that took place in Geneva, in Switzerland, and we were invited by Anne Franchette, we being my friend Vincent Fradet and myself, with whom I used to have like a very micro press, like really micro, even smaller than Titi Press, and we published like 4 books, and the whole thing, I'm not sure, but it was a festival. It was in the summer, and it was made into, it was an independent art space festival, and it was held in like this kind of city of shipping containers. And so we had one for us, which we transformed into this library to move around, like Bibliothèque à déplacer. We had our 4 books that we had published, and we had installed 24 other books with titles that came from directly from the contents of the books, or other books cited and stuff. And we invited people, you can see on the right-hand side, to come and have a look at them, but also to move them around. There was a sign saying, don't put the book back where you've taken it. So we encouraged this kind of circulation. We had a big map of the world at the back. So we were making a play between the book as a content, where content moves around, and of course that of a shipping container or a package of goods that is transported around the world. This became a book as well, the second that we published at Titi Press this time. I kind of coordinated an exercise of co-writing. So we had 6 writers, including me, and there are 4 stories, and each writer writes one round in the story. The story is of an object that is being moved around. So there's a book, it's a tale of a pig that is moved around, but there's also an idea, the little a idea, so the little petit a, so it's a reference to Lacanian psychoanalysis. So this becomes, in the text, are really weird, of course, but they move around, so no one holds the story to it's a kind of co-writing, but it's referring to this kind of shipping metaphor of shipping, shipping material. You see that the book format, which was designed by Philippe Desarzens, which was a Swiss designer with whom Titi has been working from the start, has exactly the format of a shipping container. This is also a pretty micro, small-scale publishing case. But, and briefly to finish on this question of the museum's sites and typologies and genealogies, I was mentioning that besides looking at, strictly speaking, maritime museum, there's a kind of an expanded field of types of museums that you can look at. This is something that Stephen Davis also talks about in this article, looking at, because there are a number of history museums in port cities that are really relevant for if you're interested in nautical, displays. So here are some just a couple on the top left-hand side. You recognize maybe the Museum of Asian Civilizations in Pearl in Singapore, and I've just been there again, and this is really the one that you want to go to if you want to see some actual artifacts rather than the Singapore Maritime Gallery. On the right-hand side, this is in Gothenburg, and this is a history museum, very interesting museum, but it's located in the former site of the Swedish East India Company. Yes. On the bottom left, this is in Xiamen, the Overseas Museum, really interesting. And I think there's quite a number. I think in Guangzhou, I think there's also some which I didn't see. The first slide I showed was the Shesang Museum, which I just been, which is very interesting. And on the right-hand side is also back in Singapore again. It's the Peranakan Museum. So it's and Singapore has quite a lot of these because you have the Indian Center, Chinese Cultural Center, very interesting for food. I just went there as well. So these are also very, I think, relevant in thinking of these of an extended field. But I move to my second point, which is about looking at narratives in objects and images. So if the fabric of a museum itself can be considered as part of what is displayed, infused with historical textures, we move now to into the frame of the canvas, to the galleries, to the stalls, so to speak. And it's my pleasure to show you this picture because I wanted to include it in a text that on this topic, but more specifically focusing on Europe, that I published a couple of years ago. But the British Museum, where this is house, this is my picture, but kind of refused me the only, if you want to show anything from the British Museum, you have to use their pictures. So I really don't know. But that's what it is. It is a very interesting cabinet, nevertheless. And I start with it. It's kind of opens one of the trade section. Again, it's not the only one in the museum, but and it looks in Greenwich, and it's a sort of trade Wunderkammer, and you find a number of different objects in there that create a sort of narrative in this glass panel. There is, it's not exhaustive, but there is a Roman Republican coin with an image of Neptune. There is a hand-painted Delftware ball depicting the launch of a Royal Navy vessel. There is a Swedish medal commemorating the protection of sea trade, a Hudson Bay Company token, which exploited large territories in what is now Canada, and a Manila token, said to be used in Africa as trade currency. There is a Lustware ball depicting the paddle streamer Trident and the General Steam Navigation Company, pioneer in commercial steam shipping in the early 19th century. So Neptune and the Roman coinage evoke the Roman Empire and the birth of the économie monde in the Mediterranean, the world economy. I borrowed the term that we refer to Fernand Rodel's work, which I mentioned last time. The Swedish medal reminds visitors of the political rise of the Kingdom of Sweden in the 17th century. The Hudson, the African token of the expansion of global maritime commercial networks from the 16th century onwards. And the steamship brings us into the area of industrialization, while the tramp trading silver fur reminds us that prior to the 19th century, cable technology merchants could not always prearrange their cargoes. So, each of these objects carry a story, but also put together, they also create a certain narrative that the British Museum curators want to convey. And of these, within these ships are also of particular interest. I already mentioned the Evergreen Museum, which has kind of this. But I thought I would maybe just to talk about ship models, I would under your supervision briefly go to the Hong Kong Maritime Museum, which has a lovely collection as well here, and which I believe certainly used to start the journey there. I was just having a discussion about it because my photographs in my last visit, I'm a bit ashamed to say the date back to 6 years ago, and I haven't, and so I think this bit is, anyway, I mean, if it was like that 6 years ago, it's still relevant anyway. With this different sort of, when you go into kind of start the sort of archaeological immersion in your journey at the museum, taking the visitors under strata of the city into, of course, the pre-colonial, pre-British history that the museum also wanted to represent. The visitors encounters models of junks in a gallery dedicated to traditional maritime China. There used to be also a documentary film taking you through traditional shipbuilding processes. Panel and interactive screens underline the growth of the Chinese sea trade during the Song Dynasty, and the gallery focusing on navigation routes at the time of the Ming dynasty, and I think the interactive, and maybe you can tell me more about it, also something that Museum might be developing presently. But the figure, of course, of Zheng He takes pride of place between models of enormous vessels he once led through the Indian Ocean. Born a Chinese Muslim, serving under the reign of the emperor, and he organized his 7 great maritime expeditions, which are discussed, which are presented in the gallery. This was, I mean, the story is very familiar with it, but the story goes that after his death on one of those journeys, then there was a kind of stop to this expedition, and we also don't know so much about them, I believe, because some of the archive, maybe half a century later, also were sort of destroyed. So it's kind of a bit of a mystery that attunes to it, but it also is parallel to, of course, the imminent arrival of the first Portuguese ships going around Africa. And staying with ships for a second, a recurring sub-theme within the genre, one that we already touched upon last month, is that of the shipwreck. I show you again the Tang shipwreck. I can't quite resist, although I've seen just in the meantime quite a number of other shipwreck displays, particularly in Vietnam and in Saigon. Ho Chi Minh City has a very interesting collection of shipwreck wares. And you can see the reference again to Steve Metz's publication, Shipwreck of Modernity, but I also put a reference to the edited volume on cultural history of the sea in the early modern age. This is this large this series of volumes that he was in, that goes from back of days to the present, and he's in charge of the early modern age one. And in the introduction to the book, he talks about this idea that he's developed of, I call, wet globalisation. And I quote from him: "Shifting our attention from firm ground to the unstable fluid covering most of our planet's surface emphasizes that many events in the age of discovery and empire emerged through forces and encounters that were largely beyond the control of individual humans. Even those well-known figures who have been canonized as discoverers or explorers." End of quote. And this is something that could lead to a discussion, of course, but I think it must be seen in parallel to this idea of the blue humanities and seeing kind of larger force at play in the past 5 centuries that are brought to shape the world as it is. A famous, relatively recent find here is the Kapaltek Singh shipwreck. And I'm sorry, I just couldn't exactly find the one of the displays that I wanted that I saw this just in the last month. But it basically I was struck by it because it's a large Chinese story. It's a large Chinese junk that was sailing from Xiamen to Jakarta. The route itself is very interesting, of course, because it was a route that serves migration. Chinese workers could go on to work into plantations in the then Dutch-controlled Indonesia, Jakarta being the headquarters of the Dutch East India Company. And this is the early 19th century, some 200 years ago, and it hit a reef near Belitung Island. There were 2,000 people on board, most of whom perished. Some were saved by a vessel with a British captain, I think, which I think suspicion is that it was an opium, it might have been an opium vessel. But also a lot of goods in there, a lot of wares. They were that which was excavated in about 20 years ago. I have the exact date somewhere. People knew of apparently it was. People kept, there was a trace of it. People knew that this vessel, it wasn't forgotten, which is why one of his archaeologist slash business explorer went to find it and recovered the goods from it. They were exhibited, I think, in the Netherlands, but also they were sold. And the photographs that you have on the right-hand side is actually photographs I found online from the Australian police, who sized a fragment, maybe 300 pieces that were being sold in Perth. And then by Australian laws, you know, that's illegal, and it was given back to Indonesia. So that's, you know, then I mean, I don't know if people, there might be some. I'm not particularly well versed on this maritime archaeology, but it's a very interesting topic, of course, and restitution is one that is much discussed, maybe for some of you who are particularly interested in those questions. But the other thing about this boat that caught my attention is that it has been kind of dubbed as a sort of I don't know, maybe a selling point as the Titanic of the East, and so of course Titanic, you know, that rings a bell. I'm showing you here the 1997 movie, popular romantic cinematographic fiction, directed by James Cameron with Leonardo DiCaprio and Kate Winslet. But it's of Belfast fame, and in Belfast, so we're Northern Ireland. So famous that there's a museum there called Titanic. I think it's called Titanic Experience. It's actually very good, I would say, that draws on this experience of the Titanic. I mean, I think in Northern Ireland they say that, you know, we built it and then the English sunk it. I think something like that. But it was built. It was shipyards, very famous shipyards there in Belfast. And then, as you know, hit an iceberg on the way back from New York, and so on. The museum is very interesting because it's, I mean, you see the shape, architecture is also very interesting, but the museum is not just about the sensational aspect of that story. It has a lot about the story of the city of Belfast, working class experience, classes on board, the ship, because these are these transliners, you know, as you know. Well, that's the whole romantic story between first class and third class, right? But also interesting in terms of the business that these companies used to do until the emergence of jet airlines and so on. But I decided not to talk too much about the cruise, which I've written on in the past as well. But so a very interesting urban city museum, and it's also, I make also a parallel here of someone who's kind of really interesting in thinking about maritime stories is the late Alan Sekula. And there is so much that we could put into the discussion here, but I'm showing you, well, two related between the museums and the Titanic, so to speak, because he's been interested in both photographer, cinematographer, The Forgotten Space. I'm not talking about it today, but directed with Noel Birch, 2010, goes from Rotterdam to Los Angeles, where he was based, to Hong Kong in Shenzhen, if you've seen the movie. But more rather here, the Titanic, he is an object of one of his projects, Titanic's Wake, because he went to photograph some of the studio of the movie, which were located in Tijuana, just across the American border. So he's also kind of looking at the economy of the movies, and he was quite critical of the vision that Cameron's had of the story of the Titanic, particularly the end of the movie, where there's this element of documentaries at the end or the beginning, I can't remember. But anyway, you see the point. And going to another of his project, which was captured in a very wonderful book, The Ship of Fools, the Dockers Museum, which is part of his own collection of mirabilia, of Dockers, working class and sailors objects, but also linked to the story of a peculiar ship, the Global Mariner, I believe it was called, who had been transformed between 1998 and 2000, I think, into a traveling exhibition, precisely on those experiences at sea. And to finish on this note of objects, I thought I would also show you maybe something a little bit another different take, going back to something that Séculas sure would have not been a very great fan of, but a very interesting, well, very baroque and over-the-top take on nautical displays, that of the British-English artist Damien Hirst of young British art fame, exhibit and the 2017 Venice Biennale. It wasn't part of the Biennale. It was exhibited during the Biennale as part of the Pinot collection, which is located at the Museo Grassi and on the Punta della Dogana in Venice. And I'm just showing you some of the exhibits that were. When I say over the top, it was really over the top with huge means, and it's a fantasy creation. It was called Treasures from the Wreck of the Unbelievable, and it sort of presents the visitors with maritime archaeology findings of this ship, the Unbelievable, that was sunk, with a collection of one Aulus Calidus Motan, destined for a temple of the sun, but really is a mix of is an excuse to really go into this mix of intertextual or intervisual references, with a reference to Greek mythology, to American pop, and you can and if I remember, when you went to the exhibition, you started with a documentary, that sort of a fictional documentary of this excavation, and that, I think, is a shot from this film. But if you look closely, you can see that this diver is actually carrying, you know, a sculpture that has, you know, that has stayed for many years under the sea. It's got, you know, even the shells. But if you look closely, that's actually a Mickey Mouse kind of sculpture there. So it becomes obvious when you went through the exhibition. He was, you know, very postmodern kind of thing. And, you know, the one in the middle, I put it there as well because, you know, there's Andromeda is about to be eaten by a shark. Damien Hirst is very notorious for this shark, these animals in formaldehyde, including this large shark, which was part of the Charles Saatchi collection. Anyway, and so a slight, and also an interesting thinking about market stalls. I mean, this is also someone who's very cunningly played into the contemporary art market as well. So maybe also something to keep in mind. I should try to rush, as I said. And the second point within here is moving from objects to images. And of course, images come in different forms, photographs, maps. But I thought I would focus particularly on paintings and the marine, the seascapes that I've been so particularly interested with, particularly on its contemporary version. This is in Singapore here, as well. The view of Hong Kong is in the back of that maritime trade section. The marine, of course, can be seen as associated with the development of Dutch pictorial traditions in the late 16th and early 17th century. But thinking back to genealogies, I've always find it quite interesting that you know, that's a good example of, you know, this seascape genre didn't come out pristine into the world. Here is the father of so-called seascape painting, Cornelius Vroom, as discussed in a really beautiful text by Margarita Russell. As she points out, these paintings were also really history paintings, and they were related to documenting either military encounters, particularly against the British, this Dutch-British competition on the shores, or here, this is in many ways a history painting, the return of a second expedition to the East Indies, which I'm not going into, but an important moment. So it's celebrating an event. From there, kind of a mixed element, it can become a sort of, you know, maybe marine painting focusing more on an atmospheric, but that's not even the case here, but it is the case, but not only, as you could say, but you have some very kind of atmospheric 17th century take in the genre. But, you know, it was always a mixed kind of past. There is no, like, essence, I would say, in Foucault's terms. I didn't, but of course there's a very, you know, the Hong Kong Museum, as you know, has the most wonderful collection of China trade painting. And this is related, talking about, you know, beginnings to, as Stephen Davis mentioned in the aforementioned text, the actual building up of the museum and the role of individuals such as Tan Si Frong Tsao, Mr. Anthony Hardy and the Hardy Collection, and Mr. K.L. Tam, who also played an instrumental role also in the bequest and the formation of the collection here. But I think you know more about that than I do. But I picked up one from where this is in Singapore, I think, of a Shanghai bond. Example, but really they are associated with, maybe I should have put a Guangzhou painting, with the Canton trade system put in place in 1757 during the Qing dynasty, in which non-Chinese merchant companies were allowed to buy goods in Guangzhou. And I think you are familiar with the topic, so maybe I move forward rapidly over. I was just in Guangzhou, there's some interesting shows for. I didn't see one, but the colleague curator sent me the catalogue of this, the Linian Horizon, which draws from collection of both sculpture and paintings related to this, to the China trade. And I think, I mean, I always find the China trade again as paintings as you know, hybrid objects in many ways, because of the type of demands that they were responding to, the type of artists. Often, unfortunately, or revealingly, we don't necessarily know the people who made them, but who were banking on the demand from foreign merchants to bring back a souvenir of the scene and so on. So they're quite, you know, they're in between, just like the so-called Guangcai, sorry for my pronunciation, these ceramics made for a European market. And on that note, something that might be also interesting for you is the project Exogenesis that Sabine Ducrest, the art historian, has developed in France. She published a book, an edited book, and there, but really looking at, you know, this idea of exogenesis coming from the outside, and particularly at this concept, because the idea is that these objects, the original function of the, you know, of a vase is deviated by additions to it. So here, you know, in metal and bronze, that's changed the purpose of it. The book looks specifically at European objects, but I think it can be also maybe prolific, or to think about it, of course, in a non-European context. So that's the end of my second part. Thanks for keeping with me. The rest shouldn't be too long. Well, in the end, I tried to play it safe. I don't know if that's the spatial narratives, but, you know, there's kind of an interest in narratology, I think, here, and of course, museum curators are sort of, you know, play with these narratives, not just the objects, but the way they arrange rooms. We could multiply the examples. Of course, we could look in more details than just one example, but for times and sake, and also to focus on one specific element of this, kind of looking at these two geographies that we are looking at today, Europe and East and Southeast Asia. I'm going to put in parallel two different exhibitions. And it's not actually the one here in the Maritime Museum in Belém in Portugal, but you'll see the link in a second. This is when you go to the Maritime Museum in Belém, if you get a chance. Belém, but that's a place where the Portuguese ship used to really depart. So it's just outside of Lisbon, like closer to the mouth of the river, and then you depart onto the ocean. But when you enter the museum, you really start with the figures of the navigators that we were, so Vasco da Gama, Bartolomé Diaz, and the one that will interest us is Fernando Magellan. Because first we go to Paris to a really very recent exhibition. I think it was very successful, so entitled Magellan, un voyage qui changea le monde. Magellan, a journey that changed the world, and it was organized at the Paris Musée de la Marine, the Maritime Museum in Paris, I think it was very successable, and it had an extension. I think now it might have closed if you're planning to go to Paris anytime soon, or maybe it's a bit difficult to go there. But the sorry. Yes, about this exhibition. Well, let me show you some examples of this work. You could see that the sort of animation style of the poster. That's because the exhibition was stemmed from an animation made for the Franco-German channel Arte, which is the Franco-German channel, who made this story of this sort of series about the journey, and it was used by the curators at the Maritime Museum in Paris to create this exhibition. And it mixed animation with film, sounds, statistics panels, as well as interviews with scholars, experts of different types, who talk about this journey. It follows the chronology of the journey as told by Antonio Pigafetta, who was the scribe on the ship, and on one of the 5 ships. Sorry, so the story is 5 ships left, only 3 came back, and the captain also didn't make it. That's important in the story that I'm telling today. So it returned decimated 3 years later. The date is 1519, 1522. Throughout the exhibition, there are scenographic forms that facilitate the interlacing of a plurality of voices. In the opening room, this is I think on the top left-hand side here on your screen, you had different kind of videos that were playing at the same time that gave the perspective from different types of people on board. So the captain, main sailor, cook, and so on. It gave us, a side of, this social component. Quite like that. And it also had spectacular videos, such as the one on the right-hand side, also very scenographic, trying to give visitors a sense of what it was to be in those landscapes, although obviously you couldn't at the time. And I would say also it did not shy away from addressing the misunderstandings and also the violence that those encounters brought about. And in the final room, when we reach the end of a journey, the visitor could choose between different inputs in which order to see them. So a sort of open space, spatial syntax. So rather than going just from A to B, you're in B, but you can choose C, D, E, F, so something, which way you want to see them. And amongst the films that you could see here, there was one that discussed in particular the case of Enrique, the figure here on the bottom right-hand side. This is Enrique de Malacca, a local navigator who had been forcibly taken on board in Malacca in 1511, so right at the moment when the story goes, the Portuguese managed to treacherously, the story goes, to capture by force the city from its Malay rulers, and brought back as a slave to Magellan, but it became kind of his right-hand man, and so much so that he was in his testament and so on and so forth. There's a whole discussion in the exhibition about the fact that at some point he might probably have betrayed the the Spanish crew, who was not very keen on letting him go free anyway, in the Philippines. I mentioned this here just to briefly because I think here clearly the exhibits, the curators are trying to have this plurality of voices represented. But I'll go to my second example, which is even more radical example of that, which is a contemporary art piece by the artist Fuad Ben Osman, Malaysian artist. I don't know if you've heard of Fuad's work. But clearly, the point is that both was made in Paris, but is made also. I mean, it's a famous point. It's not a new point, but it emphasized in Fuad's installation is that if Enrique de MACAH, this is his legendary name, was taken in Malacca and then went back to the Philippines, perhaps from there he made it back to Nusantara, where he came from. And in that case, then that means, well, the first circumnavigator is of course not Magellan, who unfortunately for him died in a skirmish in the Moluccas, but is probably this very Malay navigators. I say Malay, but Fuad actually says is an object of kind of dispute as well, as well as to who this person was and to what background he might have been. The memorial is also drawing from this book on the left-hand side, because of course the narrative is also interesting here. The Panglima Awang, famous book by Harun Amun Rashid, who revisits this story and became famous for it, and it inspires the display by Fuad, which was shown I think for the first time in Singapore in 2016, and then at the Sharjah Biennale in 2017. I'm showing you some examples, some pictures from Fuad that Fuad shared with me. The point is that it features paintings, I mean he's a wonderful painter, but also sculptures. There's objects alluding to archaeological findings, videos. He made like a fictional video, plus there are some videos which I didn't show here, also of experts talking about who was these figures, and again this dispute as where exactly he came from. I would like just to quote very interesting from an interview I did with Fuad on his aims in kind of mixing these different elements. And we should be saying that the objects that you see, some are actually historical objects, and some are made by him, and it doesn't tell you which ones are what. I quote from Fuad Ben Osman. It mixes fact and fiction, the memorial. It's not totally factual. I reproduced some of the artifacts and I reimagined some. Then I also included 16th century objects in the same space. It is also informed by my own experience. Almost every time I enter a museum, I have this feeling, this suspicion regarding the objects in the museum. Are they real? You look at the object, notice how beautiful they are, how pristine, and then see that they are dated to the 11th, 12th century. You start to have this doubt. It translates into an element I wanted to give to the public, to experience this uncertainty. Because history really depends on who writes the history. It's like editing a video. You have so many footage, and you choose some specific footage that really fits your narrative. History is just like that. End of the story. But this reflection, a beautiful reflection, I think, by Fuad nicely mirrors these layered operations by which narration proceeds. In the scheme of Mikebal's narratology, there are three interconnected layers, levels, that of a fable, both signified and imagined, becomes by a process of what she calls focalization, putting into a certain angle a story, which in turn becomes a narrative text in words or in images or in a mix of the two, as in the case that we have discussed. Osman calls Enrique, which you see here on the left-hand side, the sculpture of, an accidental navigator, and depicts him in a squatting pose rather than upright, while visitors were invited to peruse in an open spatial arrangement, the mix of objects, artworks, paintings, and so on. And different contemporary experts and so on that I mentioned. So basically mixing, making a sort of superposition of narratives that leaves the room open, almost I would say in Umberto Eco's term, a kind of an open work. One of his famous books. And briefly to finish this journey today on nautical exhibition, nautical trade, I'll just finish as a way of conclusion with a couple of projects I've been involved in. I mentioned here in the past few years that kind of play with some of these operations that maritime museums or actors, agents, curators working with maritime materials do in the set of contemporary art. So this is one, an exhibit called The Length of a Dot is One Unit, which I was involved in. It was kind of initiated by two artists, and Cora Piantoni and Dorota Lukianska, who asked me to join this kind of Switzerland and to Swedish collaboration in Gothenburg. And really, of all the people you see listed below, I'm really the odd one out here, because all the others are quite serious, career, artist is their occupation. But I did make an effort as part of this show. So it was held at the library in Gothenburg. The title is a reference to Morse code, the way that the Morse works. But I made a small piece, audio kind of piece, with a sort of installation. It was quite minimal. Table, a chair, and then this a bit of chinaware, and this, which I got into like a vintage shop in Gothenburg. But the audio was called Souvenirs from Guangzhou. It's kind of a 10 minutes audio narrative, but that explores the images of global maritime navigation, taking as a source the journal of the captain, a Scottish captain, Colin Campbell, on the first voyage of the first journey of the Swedish East India Company, leaving from Gothenburg to Guangzhou, who was the so-called supercargo not the captain of the ship, but in charge of the goods. Two people, and in the story, there's a lot of this. He's having a lot of problem with the captain, in fact. But so that's a little bit sort of an evocation of this world that we were talking about in the China trade paintings and so on. Another example here, not one that but one that I was involved in, but really curated by Giulia Bussetti, 2S, sorry Giulia, called Between Ebb and Flow. It was held in Hamburg, in various sites. I mention it here because she really tried to do something. There was some pieces inside, but there was a lot of it in open air, and the festival was really alternate. It was kind of alternate, but with a number of pieces there, looking at Hamburg in relation to the river. There was also, these are pieces that were made during the pandemic, so there was an element of that. Just showing you one example of the contributions here. That was by the duo, the New Liquidity, Selma Boscailo and Anders Selin, who made who worked with sound and coding. So they coded this whole bridge to recreate experiences of the complex transformation through industrialization of the Elbe. And what you see on the right-hand side is that I took this opportunity to invite them to do a contribution for the first Teti Press journal, focusing on the theme of transindustriality, and they wrote a piece, which again, this one is already online, so you can also order a printed version if you want. We need it, but if you just want to, you can also find it in open access, Vertex. It's really, really interesting. They also had a lot of trouble because they coded this whole bridge, and then the city shut it. So they sort of have remade it, but it was all about the impact of industry on fishing communities, workers, inhabitants, particularly related to pollution here on the Elbe. Another pandemic piece that I don't know if maybe I have mentioned this one somewhere in my Hong Kong visits, but is the ghost ship project. This was a very intimate project because Switzerland was quite relatively not so, it was not too bad to live the pandemic compared to France, for instance, or the UK. But still, we had the exhibition right at the moment where you were by law not allowed to have more than 5 people in a space. So our exhibition was really kind of, limited. And Ghost Ship, the theme kind of fitted quite well in that exploring spectral narration with a number of artists that you see here on the bottom. Has that on the left-hand side? This is Cora wearing a mask, drawing some of her photography archive. On the walls of the exhibition space called Culture Folger. And of course I had to have a sort of Café de la Marine, and I cooked some food at some point, some fish soup to go with it. I made a film, a short film, a sort of kind of a poetic walkthrough, the time as you see. So this you can find through Teti. You can see it if you want, and you see the works better that were displayed at the time. And the most recent one, of course, is the hybrid marines. I already mentioned that last month. That we just published last year. The work on the cover is that of Cora Piantoni's work with someone with whom I've been working for a while. She's a German artist based in Switzerland, and this is part of her a series of work she made on Docker's hand sign. So the hand sign that I use still on docks because sometimes they can be more efficient than sound, just to say, hey, you need to stop here. But also relate to gender on the docklands, because these are specifically women dockers there. I think in Gothenburg in that piece, and she also made an interview with one of the persons who explained what her job is, and she let us use the work on the cover, which also designed by Philippe Desarsins, who I mentioned. You have the content on the left-hand side. There's a core art history bit, because originally it was kind of an art history project. I co-edited this one with Brian Biggs, I mentioned before, and you have some cool people. They're all very cool, actually. Really some nice text with the people in Naples I'm collaborating with. Thierry Dufresne has a text on the photographic practice of Orhan Pamuk. And there's a link between Fouad Ben Osman, who was very interested in Orhan Pamuk's Museum of Innocence. I don't know if you know of Museum of Innocence. It's the title of a book by this. Orhan Pamuk is a novelist, and he made a museum out of it, which kind of takes us into Istanbul. Anyway, I can't do you the whole content, but you can always. This we will launch It has a limited print, but we will launch we're doing the online version, open access. In June, and I can send a link to my colleagues. So if if people want to have a look, you can have a look at that. It has 3 parts, as you can see: interconnected windows, uncharted waters. These are all the really kind of art history texts. The third one, maritime resonance, is actually interspaced throughout the book, and these are all artistic research pieces. So they are like artistic work, which is something that we try to do with this publication, to have draw from the academic know-how and also to mix it with artistic research developments. And all the people here that you see in the first third parts represents, they propose some pieces, but they're all the folks who are basically participating in the project that I'm involved in right now. It's an exhibition that we open in quite soon, 3 weeks in Basel. So in Switzerland, Switzerland, what do you want to do? It's a maritime exhibition. Yes, because Basel is a port. It's the hinterland port of Switzerland, and I ended up bringing a lot of students there during the pandemic, because I couldn't take them to Hamburg. And the project, we had a workshop last year looking at Maritime Basel with some visits into the ports, meeting some people there. You see the group here on the left-hand side. And it's leading to this exhibition called Port Heads and Riverbeds. Because also, when we did with the workshop, we went to the port and we were very interested in that, but Basel is also a place, it also has an important industrial past, also linked to the pharmaceutical industries and to paint as in paint, like to make paint, and by that it also has issues of ecological pollution of the soil and the riverbed. And there's a chemistry museum, which is a very kind of independent association, which is really cool and looks at these histories and collect oral histories, and they're kind of involved in the project. So we sort of combine this kind of the maritime interest that we have at TETI with this trans-industrial interspace dialogue. And I think, yes, sorry, I was too long again. This ends my discussion on this nautical trade, displays and exhibition. Thank you so much for sticking with it and for your attention.
Thank you very much, Professor G. Professor G gave us a very intellectual and holistic understanding of the existing maritime museum and also trade representation with a lot of cases, not just in Europe and Asia, right? So I wonder that is it now open the floor for questions if you have.
Thank you, Professor G. I find it really fascinating. I have a question about representation. I was just wondering when Maritime Museum represent global trade as something very, connected people and also culture. So how do you think it addresses the fact that some routes today are actually quite strategic, Strait of Hormuz? So how are they representing the fact that these routes are actually places for tension and conflict and control? Do you think that some exhibition actually making it more positive and smoother than it actually is? Yeah, so that's my question. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Very, very interesting question, of course. It may be which museums, of course, we're talking about. And I mean, from the European museums, there, you could, I would say, yes, probably you could argue that there is still, I mean, the British Museum, I think, is an interesting example, an element of smoothing things out as well. Having evolved from perhaps a more monolithic discourse, however, and so maybe have sort of tried to and I think that's the French are probably a good example as well. So trying to be a bit to address those histories that also we have seen being asked by the public and by academia as well. It's on the other hand, perhaps. I don't know, I mean, in Hong Kong and Singapore it could be an interesting example. I think I just mentioned the Zhenghe, but I think if you go further down the galleries, there's an interesting balance because you have the China trade painting, the Hong Kong moment, but you also have an evocation of resistance to, with main important figures of resistance to European encroachment in the European encroachment in China in the 19th century. So I think that's kind of addressed in the museum. I think Stephen Davis in his text that I mentioned, he was I don't know what people will think about it, but he was pointing out that there was kind of an interesting blend here, based also on Hong Kong population and the sort of mix of influences here. I didn't. Maybe the Coastal Defense Museum is perhaps more direct perhaps not in addressing this question. And for the museums that I've seen in China, I'm trying to catch up because something we didn't talk about, that there's, you know, there's a growth in those museums, so maybe something for interest also for people here who are looking for employment afterwards. But I went to Chongzhou, which is an interesting museum, and the one in Fuzhou. Well, I think the one in Fuzhou was quite interesting because it's dealing with this really this confrontational moment. But they did quite an interesting job in saying, well, you know, because there was this kind of this, you know, inevitable interlacing of competencies, of skills in developing this new industry, maritime industry, and new industry. So yeah, and maybe the third point, yeah, I think it's worth looking at. I think when I mentioned Benoît de l'Étoile, I think he has quite also a nuanced argument in saying that, yes, you know, the 1930s, you had this kind of, you know, really we're still in the colonial moment, and you have colonial personnel who is involved, but they also, in the book, he argues that that it's not like it was just a black and white relation. That's what he argues, that there was also a sort of realization that there was another there that was to be recognized and not just domesticated. That's what he argues. You can see the book, and maybe you can see what you think. But yeah, I think that's a really good point. I'm trying. Thank you.
Maybe I have a question. Thanks so much for sharing a lot of innovative projects. Also the colonial history of the European Maritime Museum. I'm wondering that about the methodology of thinking, the whole history of Maritime Museum or trade representation. That are you suggesting the Foucault's genealogy approach? I'm not sure that I just want to clarify that it should be, the future should be more about micro-history that connect with some life experience or interesting story that you include the shipwreck and also the slave, the working classes. What is the narrative, how is ship and what I'm not sure that you are suggesting is maybe your main argument that suggesting that is for to think about the future or the shipping patterns or development. So.
Thank you. Thank you. Good question. I mean, the first thing that comes to my mind is I think if the reason that it's maybe that an argument or my argument doesn't come on that note fully to the fore is perhaps that I've been quite interested in both sides of the coin. So on the one hand, I think I've been interested in Genesis, and so I've been interested in saying, oh, look, you know, this is the French Maritime Museum, and it comes from, you know, some royal collections. It was set up early 19th century at the moment of, you know, the museum nation building. So it has that story there, or the building, what they can tell us about this moment of creation and what we can associate with. And so it's something that I've personally been long interested in, to try and find some, you know, because it brings information, so you can sort of think about the past in that way. But on the other hand, mitigated by the fact that these origins, as mentioned by this reference to genealogy by Foucault, but are also not as straightforward as they might seem to be in the first place. And this is true, I think, so both on the side of the errors that Foucault mentions, and that this trail of complications, but also of this kind of when I was talking about the marines, and the notion of hybridity is a good point in this reflection as well. This is something I talked more with Brian in the introduction to hybrid marines, looking at the history of the term before using it to contemporary art practices, because hybridity is a term that we also comes from its use in botany and sort of in management of plants and science, and the way that you could create a novel from a mix of two origins. But in the 19th century, it also became loaded, certainly in Europe, with ideological narratives regarding ethnicity and so on. So it became really, kind of immersed in those type of discourses. Before being reappropriated more recently in the 20th century as a form of progressive and a form of superseding the sort of monolithic discourse of origin. So in that way, I think yes, the Genesis is interesting, but we want to keep it with this sort of immediate, or you could say, fragmentation. Attention to the fragmentation nature of the past and the present. So perhaps micro-histories is a way of doing that. Actually, I think in Paris, actually, I was, because I visited this the Maritime Museum in Paris recently, so I went to see MACAH show, but I also noticed in the main collection, they also have inserted these panels, also with, you have an interview with someone who works on the cargo ship, or someone who works, so they are trying to go more within this micro-histories, and maybe that's a way also of preventing a sort of of a bottleneck of a discursive imposition on the visitor. And we more interactive. I don't know if people, maybe interaction is also, I don't know so much, maybe also a way of, when the public, galleries for giving back feedback, so might be a way of, but this is also an aspect that maybe you know more about it than I do.
There was also a question.
And I'm quite interested in the critical approach toward museum and galleries, because I think it's quite new directions, because you adopt a critical approach rather than a very traditional and a serious one. So people try to ask, is it real, or the histories written by some people? Is it fake or it is truth? Yeah, so I think that is quite interesting. And so my question is, because for some big museum, they actually receiving the fundings from the government. So how can they avoid ideologies from the government or the top level? Yeah, this is my first question. And my second question is how to balance the theories and the critical thinking, critical approach in the museum and galleries. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Well, I think the first type of question is kind of difficult one to answer. One thing that I could mention is perhaps that also. Let me go back to Michel Foucault. Perhaps he could be on a point. But Foucault talks about discursive formation. So someone who's interested in seeing a sort of a network, a framework within which, in a certain era, groups of people can think and express it. That's sort of the terms within which, in a given time and age, you are able to formulate your thoughts, and that sort of inevitably determines it. So someone who deconstructed also the notion of the author and so on. So perhaps paying attention to this, to the forces that surround us, that we might even not be aware of, is perhaps already a way of trying to negotiate differing context within which the terms of what we are expressing are being dictated, be they obvious or latent in a way. And the second question, well, that's also a good point. I don't know, because I think it would be also interesting maybe to think, to hear what you think as future museum or colleagues who might be working with museums. Of course, one thing that comes to mind is of course that museology and maybe to go to more what I'm perhaps familiar with, sort of curatorial practices, are have a sort of whole theoretical field that literature that develops for curating. I would refer here maybe to Swiss on curating journal. It's really quite good, and it's very kind of trying to catch up with the latest developments in aesthetics, so in artistic practices, as they come to inform curatorial practices in dialogue as well. So you might say that in that respect, I think I would think that I mean, because as in a museum, curators, and you have some very practical things to deal with, right? So, not just the narrative, but also managing the collection, the budget, dealing with the public. That's all part of of the various roles that you have to deal with. But certainly, I think, hopefully, I would think that element where you link with discussions as to why we are organizing, showing this or that, and for whom, and what should be the role of visitors, and which kind of visitors, or you name it, etc., is one that is fruitful for practitioners. So I hope and I think that they do that as well. But I hope maybe I'm happy to share to see other. Answers. Yeah.
Yes, I think because I find most of the time when we go into the museum or galleries, especially for some big ones, it's kind of the attitude is quite weird because people, they are very serious towards those exhibitions. It's kind of worship, but they don't have a connection with the active experience. So I think maybe that is some changes could be happen in the future. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks to you. Thanks.
But I have a question from the audience from Taiwan University. That she is quite amazed by this final project, this photo, and she asked, could you share more about the experience of this outing, how to incorporate into the museum, how to...
Yes, thank you. Yes, thank you very much. I'm happy to do so. Also, perhaps because it can blend also in the in the way that the previous question also was referring to. This, I mean, this is kind of quite. This is our project. The one I mentioned before in Gothenburg, there was, I was invited to participate by Cora Piantoni, who's there, she's there, and Dorota Lukjanska. They both artists. They had a project called Seafaring that they've been doing for a while, and they did a really cool show in Porto, in Portugal, and also, and then decided to do one in Gothenburg where Dorota lives. And they have this like working practice which I join them, but I think for me it really kind of worked well with what I'm trying to do in TETI, Textual Experience of Transuniversal, and not to be just on my own and do things with other people. And so the idea is, you have some initiators, so on this project also a bit of curating, where you have some people who take the lead, so in that case, Cora, Giulia Bussetti, and myself. But it's also in dialogue with the participating artists, and it's quite collective. There's an element of quite an important collective aspect to it. And in both cases, as for the project I wasn't involved in Porto, there's also an element of field research on it. So the idea that you don't just, okay, we have a show in Porto, what could I show there that could be, relevant? No, you go there beforehand, so there's a workshop, and to try and to visit a number of places and things. In fact, the next TETI journal that I'm doing for this year, called Metabolic Naples, Cora is also part of it, is one that I organized in Naples on that model. And so, in the case of Gothenburg, it was really, we had a week there with visits with the labor representative of the union on the Gothenburg harbor. It was very critical as well. Also a representative of the more business side of the harbor. We had visits with art folks in the area, in the city. We have various places in Basel, similar things. So here we took this group picture in one of the compared to it's not so big compared to your size here in Hong Kong, but one of the this is like a trip, a business that does rail to ship to truck. Transbordement, to go back to the book that I know, transbordement is French is kind of difficult to translate, but potentially transshipping, but also to this chemistry museum the guy there is very charismatic and tells the story very well. So everyone was quite influenced, and the pattern that you see on the behind there. It looks a bit like the river riverbed, etc. But it's actually, it's the designer made it from when we said, but it borrowed from an image that we took from the chemistry museum's collection of kind of old style textile blocks, in wood patterns, and you then print on the textile to make. So it kind of also evokes this kind of this textile and painting, pigmentation industry that has made Basel rich, but is also problematic for health issues. People, having health problematic and so on till today. So yeah, so in Basel it was only. We were there for 3-4 days, but we went twice. Anyway, so this is the idea. We go there and we have a discussion, and then we met online, also with the Gothenburg people, kind of every month, or maybe less for the Basel, to kind of discuss how we put things together, and then people make specific pieces, specific artworks for that. So that's a little bit the working process. I like that so much so that I kind of borrowed it to. This one I kind of initiated with Cora, and then we're happy to have Dorota and other folks, and in Naples as well, so I hope that we can pursue this line. So often I find a balance between, working in a group, the more horizontal you are, the more time it takes, but the more maybe shared grounds you can have. Maybe in my experience, sometimes, it's good if, there's a balance between the horizontal platform and maybe the need at some point you need someone to push things forward a little bit because this one. But it's also a question of time, I think. But thank you for your question. I hope it gives a little bit of an insight into this project. Yeah, we're having some events as well there. I'm cooking at some point, I think.
Time is up. Okay, thanks so much again for Professor G for the inspiring talk. And let's give a big clap for him. Okay, thank you very much for participation and your questions. Very insightful, very interesting dialogue. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, and stay tuned with MACAH and the directors also here. Good photo. Okay. Yes.
Thank you, everyone.
Photo again.